Hey everyone, Ankur here. Ben and I recorded this episode before we learned the next day about the death of former Bengals running back Rudy Johnson. It's being reported that this is potentially related to CTE, and we want to send our condolences out to Rudy's family, the Bengals organization, and anybody else impacted by his death. We also grew up watching Rudy play, and so this affects us personally in our fandom, and we hope that research continues and work continues to lighten the impacts of CTE and traumatic brain injury. If you are in crisis, we do suggest that you reach out to the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 or contact the crisis text line by texting 741-741.
The Think Good podcast, where therapists talk about TV shows, movies, books, and life.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Think Good podcast. I'm Ankur Varma, LCPC.
And I am Dr. Tayeba, Shaikh, clinical psychologist.
And so welcome back to our podcast. If you haven't heard one of our episodes in the past, we have covered a variety of topics that are in pop culture and TV, and really what we think is, important to discuss or get into, both as two therapists, but also just two kind of human observers of how things are going in the world.
Yeah, I think we are just excited to be back, do another episode. Ankur, throw a little background our way on what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, so today, as you might be able to tell if you're watching us on video for some weird reason that you're watching a podcast on video, we have our Bengals gear on. As you may know, both Tayeba and I are from Cincinnati, and so we are both big Cincinnati Bengals fans. And appropriately, with the start of the NFL season and with the beginning of our yearly depression around NFL football, we are here to discuss the NFL and specifically getting into why the NFL is so attractive and so hard to look away from, even though there's a decent amount of controversy. And because we are clinicians, we're going to talk a little bit about TBIs and concussions and some of those impacts based off the book League of a Denial.
Yeah. So I want to just say it is very hard to be a Cincinnati Bengals fan, but here we are. And I think also to your point, with the NFL season starting with a lot of us kind of back into the throes of fall, it's very traditional. It's very nostalgic, a lot of psych undertones in terms of why we love our teams and why do we torture ourselves, and the anxiety, the depression, the trauma even, all around all of us, unless you're winning Super Bowls left and right, can be painful.
Yeah, I'm in depression avoidance right now because if I don't know when you all are listening to this episode, maybe it's October, maybe it's December, maybe it's in the middle of the summer sometime. But right now, when we are recording, the latest on the Bengals front is that they got beat pretty badly yesterday and have probably lost their star quarterback for most of, if not the entire season. And this is a recurring kind of theme here for us as Cincinnati Bengals fans, really throughout our whole life, is we can't have good things.
Yeah, and I think we can't have good things. Well, I think one of the things that's hard about it is we are just loyal. And I think if we could just really get that out of the way, we love Cincinnati, we love Joe Burrow, but we're going to just kind of slow down and try to be present and do some mindful things to get through the season, because it's going to be a long, long one.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Okay, so we're going to get into kind of the theme here, and this is going to act a little bit like an interview in one sense, because I have not read the complete League of Denial book. Tayeba, you have, and so I'm going to defer to you as kind of informing us a little bit on some of these themes, and then we'll both kind of talk about our thoughts or our views on TBIs and the impact of and the popularity of the NFL, and see what comes up here. So let's get into it, and if you can start us off with maybe a little bit of a summary here behind this book, League of Denial. I've seen the movie Concussion, which is, I think, tied to the book. I don't know if it's directly related to the book, but obviously closely tied to some of the research that was done that led to where we're at now with concussions in the NFL. So can you fill us in a little bit on this book and some of the background here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you all haven't read League of Denial or seen the movie, I would say probably in the last 10 to 12 years, we've been talking about concussions a lot more, not just in the NFL, but in general. And so, what League of Denial did was it really essentially highlighted central claims around the direct link that exists around like repeated trauma of CTE and evidence from players like Mike Webster, I think was, kind of the main player that they talked about. But it really detailed the NFL's campaign of denial around what is going on uh, with CTE. And I kind of will get into what chronic traumatic encephalopathy is. It's a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma, but kind of just what the NFL was doing to cover it up. And Dr. Amalu and his research really like coining CTE and all of us trying to kind of understand, okay, what is happening here because it's really getting diagnosed post-mortem. And so we're not necessarily seeing that diagnosis beforehand. So we're really looking for symptoms of what's happening. And there's this huge behavioral connection of like, what are the psychological symptoms? What are the physiological symptoms? And how do they manifest together? And so I think a lot of us that have read the book, that have watched the movies, that have been following this research are just learning more and more exposure of what's been going on. Like this is not new, but there's a lot of newer language around it. And I think that's kind of at the crux of this book. And funnily enough, the book came out in 2013, and I was doing my postdoc fellowship in Indiana. And my supervisor actually told us to read the book because we were doing a neuropsych fellowship, actually. So we were working pretty heavily in TBI, traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's, dementia. And so he was a huge NFL fan. He knew the other interns and postdocs were as well. And so he really was like, I think we should read the book and kind of talk about different brain injuries because essentially what was happening was CTE was presenting similarly to Alzheimer's, and we weren't necessarily we didn't know everything about it. And so the authors, who are actually brothers, they went on to win Peabody, actually. This turned into a PBS frontline documentary, actually, League of Denial. So just a lot more media coverage. And that's kind of, we'll get into it, but that's kind of the crux of the book, which is outlining what CT is, how it's impacted the NFL, and then what was the NFL's response to basically exposing this research of Dr. Amalu's.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was just thinking about the timeline for me personally learning about concussions and TBIs in grad school. And I remember specifically attending a special lecture from a professor who talked about his own experiences with TBI. I think he had been in the Navy and had,
Wow.
been in boxing while in the military. And so he had personal experience that then led to his research. And this must have been about 2011, 2012. So right before the book came out and kind of blew the door open on this discussion around concussion and TBIs. And I remember what stuck with me then was him making a statement around 1 or 2 concussions can have a long-term impact on your cognitive function, your emotional function, and so many other things that we're going to get into. And it took me back to the high school culture that we grew up in, and remembering high school football players that I had known for a long time who joked about having multiple concussions already before the age of 18 playing sports. And so, I think that was really what stuck with me about this, was that this doesn't just include professional athletes, but includes kids, right? Minorities,
Right.
minors who are playing youth sports and are susceptible to, these kinds of injuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we just weren't talking about it as much, I think, right? And I think us growing up, like, it's not a secret that football is dangerous, but I don't necessarily think we were really talking about the long-term effects and even getting the medical treatment that we need for some of the short-term effects. And I think that we'll get into this a little bit, but that's kind of why we thought this would be a great book to cover is because no matter what is going on and the research is going on, and honestly, we know the NFL is like deeply problematic for many reasons, even outside of CTE, we can't stop watching. And we are like, man, what is going on? So I think it will be helpful to kind of go through and understand some of the research, some of the changes, some of the things that have stayed the same. But if you haven't already, it's a fantastic read. If you're not into reading it, you should watch the movie or even the PBS
Absolutely.
documentary, because I think it's really informative.
Absolutely. Let's get into it. You started to talk about what is CTE. Can
Yeah.
you give us a brief background of not just CTE, but kind of concussions, TBIs, so we're all speaking a little bit of the same language here, and then what does chronic traumatic encephalopathy really include?
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think you will have, when you're talking about neuropsych and you're talking about some of these cognitive pieces here, brain disease gets caused by repeated head trauma, right? And so when we're talking about dementia, when we're talking about Alzheimer's, when we're talking about TBI, there's different types of head injuries that exist, and there's different types of trauma to the head. A TBI will be like an external force that you undergo similarly to CTE, right? You will have some type of force that comes in, and that will cause some of these delays. It'll be with your motor planning. It will have a psychological effect as well. So changes in your mood are huge. I think talking about CTE specifically, the progressive sort of brain disease that happens is because it's repeated over and over and over again. And there is a true disruption of just function. You're essentially killing nerve cells. And that's why CTE is so traumatic, because it's just repeated. It's not like going in, to TBI and even Alzheimer's, you're going in, you're getting a live diagnosis like while you're alive. So you're like, okay, well, now I have to kind of shift the way I'm living. That's not really the case with CTE. You can be active and playing sports for a very long time while living with CTE, and it can just present as aggression, mood swings, cognitive issues, which is like memory loss, confusion. It can almost look like brain fog with COVID, to be honest. And you'll just sort of say, okay, when it gets a little bit more severe, you'll see the motor problems that I'm talking about, like balance and tremors, but that's usually down the line. And in younger people, the cognitive decline is actually more common, which is a little bit scary. So, well, a lot bit scary. So I think what's hard is that you get this sort of probable diagnosis in living patients, but research is ongoing. And I think that's what we really learned with Dr. Amalu is we're not going to stop researching this. Yes, we as an part, I like to think I'm part of Dr. Amalu's crew, but he's like, I mean, he's up against a $10 billion industry, right? And so you're trying to expose the NFL, you're going to get pushback. Um, it's going to be shady on their end. And so I think that is really at the core of this book and of this exposure is you're getting both the educational piece of like, what is CTE? We get into talking about players and some famous cases here, but ultimately we're really talking about what's happening right now, because football is still very much taking a hold over the country. We've got these young kiddos starting so young, playing, going college, going pro. And so, like, what are we trying to do to at least have some damage control or try to understand the severe effects of this disease?
Yeah, and there's a couple things that stick out to me too as you're talking about this, right? Because one recent quote that I remember from the commissioner of the NFL, Roger Goodell, is that he doesn't want to partner with Apple and Coke. He wants to be known alongside Apple and Coke, meaning the NFL as a brand needs to be on the global level of a Coca-Cola, right? Which is probably amongst the biggest, if not the biggest worldwide brand, right? And so
Yeah,
you're talking about a goal here for a business to be the biggest brand or one of the biggest brands in the world, especially in sports. And then, this other on the other hand, what you just talked about in terms of the injury or the potential impact of playing this sport, which can be quite damaging. And, especially for a sport, right? In most sports, right? You have to start young. If you want to make it
sure.
professionally, if you want to, get the repetition in, and increase your skill set, increase your level of play, the challenge, of the folks that you play with, right? And you want to keep getting bigger and better, then you have to be playing continuously. And I think that's what stuck out to me, even in the movie, they portrayed this, kind of Hollywood moment where it's like he's starting to release the research, and then he gets a phone call from like somebody with the NFL who says, it kind of gives him a half threat. And, that's the the conundrum here is that we, have this huge product that we are all, so many of us grew up with as it's kind of a part of our lives, moments that we shared with family members, right? Watching sports is such a big part of American culture. And, and then on the other hand, we have this serious health crisis around TBIs. And then, of course, this goes beyond the NFL and football as a sport, right? Because, we've also seen a high incident of TBIs in women's soccer, for example, has a high rate, in children's sports where they don't have full control over their bodies yet, and so a lot of different applications here that I think there's while I think the beginning of this conversation is quite pessimistic
Yeah.
and cynical, right? I can feel it. I think there is some optimism here around what has come from this, and so maybe let's get into that. So can you tell us, I guess, a little bit more detail in terms of Dr. Amalu, and he was studying this player's brain, Mike Webster, who is
Mhm.
a famous Pittsburgh Steeler and Hall of Famer, right? An all-time great player. And if you're not familiar with the sport, Pittsburgh Steelers in the 70s and other decades, I choose to blank out the Steelers' history as a Bengals fan, but were good for a very long time. And so you had these really staple players and teams that were, part of these hard hitting Steelers defenses. That's what they were known for, right? And that's what was celebrated in the sport for a long time was these really hard hits. And then we go to learn both in this book and in the overall story here of things that there's some other stuff going on. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't just Dr. Bennett Amalu. I mean, he had his professional colleagues, and they were really doing this like, I mean, he was spearheading it, but they were really doing this joint research. And essentially, these scientists were coming in, they were connecting the suffering that was happening with these NFL players, and they were saying, hey, this is directly related. This is something different. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me, and this is crazy because I read this book like 13 years ago, 14 years ago, was that CTE similarly looked like Alzheimer's disease, but there was a very specific, believe it was on the imaging, that the blood vessels looked different. And that's how they caught it. Like, that's how they really differentiated, hey, this is a different beast. Like, this is something else. And so, really, what Dr. Amalu was doing was coming out and saying, we are dealing with something different. It is catastrophic here. And the NFL really resisted and went to the extreme length of really like discrediting the research, which was, the title of League of Denial, and essentially campaigned this denial. It was largely compared to the tobacco industry trying to debunk that like smoking's bad for you. And so a lot of parallels between the industries. So really that's what this book was about, and that's what this research was we are this is not we're not going to stay quiet, and we want to get this research out there because families and people and parents and humans should know what they're getting into when they commit to this sport. And it's not just like limited to football as you talked about, but um that's essentially like, what we were talking about specifically to Dr. Amalu and the league.
Yeah, and I remember too when this stuff started to come out, I think we were obviously educated on some of these things. So I don't think it caught a lot of us off guard, at least maybe in the field. I think what caught me off guard was to the level to which, these
Yeah.
injuries can have an impact and how quickly, we had some of these players are, just in their 40s or early experiencing symptoms and effects from something that they called their livelihood, right? And so there's this kind of contradiction here around how to feel about this and think about this. Then of course this is a business entity trying to protect its product. What happens next here in terms of obviously now we're talking about this over 10 years later. I know there have been some changes which we're going to get to in just a moment, but how does this really start to then gain steam? How does it kind of break through?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Dr. Amalo's research at the time, just like when all of this was happening with the PBS special, the book, the research, families started to listen. People started to listen. The league was getting sued. Like things were happening and players were passing away and we were having more and more research done post-mortem and studying the brain. And this is similar to what was happening with Lewy body dementia. Like we didn't know what was going on until after someone had passed away. And so really when you're looking at that science, you're trying to do some deep longitudinal studies and really understand, okay, like what like from beginning to end, what was happening with this individual. And so I think a lot of this caught some traction and I think it had consequences. Obviously, you and I are sitting here in our Bengals gear and NFL is still standing as it will. But I do think it caused people, I would say, and I mean, we're 40. This is the first time I've said that. We're both 40. And so I'm going to edit that out. I think that more people our age are kind of talking about this intentionality around what sports will our children play, what effects will that have, what is the safety, rather than, and I mean, this is like an interesting thing too, right? Like being children of immigrants, like I don't know how much like if we, if you know my brother, he wasn't a football player, that guy, but like if he did decide to play football, like I don't know that my parents would like have said anything or known much about it or and so I think like part of this is a cultural piece too, right? Which is like we are in the culture now of understanding this like connection that we have here to having lived again similar lives to our kids, being in school here, being in America, and like kind of being more aware. And so if we get into it cross culturally, there's just a higher awareness and maybe more discussion around it. That doesn't mean that parents aren't allowing their kiddos to play some of these contact sports, but I do think the conversations are happening a lot more around safety. And we're going to get into what the NFL has done to make changes. That similarly across the country has happened with elementary, middle, high school,
Mhm.
college, where there was no way for it to not have a ripple effect, where we are starting to look at protocols differently. I would actually love to hear your thoughts too about the masculinity piece here of like playing through the pain and kind of your thoughts around that because that is such a cultural gendered
Mm.
piece here where young men at a young age are really taught to just kind of put up with the pain, get through it, suck it up, all the things. And so I think that's very much a part of the culture of football as well.
Yeah, and I want to, I think it's extremely important that we get into the masculinity piece of this because it's goes hand in hand with some of the core issues here. Football is a sport of violence. Nobody will deny that. And, if you spend any time in a locker room, fun aside, I did play soccer for a year in high school. And however, I signed up for football so that I could get out of class early
I
one
didn't know
year.
that.
And so every time I was playing, like on the soccer field, I could hear my name sometimes be called on the football field. I did not play football. So, I think masculinity in sports goes hand in hand, right? Because, sports are meant to be physically aggressive, and that is what usually the typical definition of masculinity is tied to is the physical aggression, violence, and this is a sport where you are literally taught to use your body as a weapon. And, you will hear this rhetoric in locker rooms, in huddles, around the country where you are trying to amplify and awaken the violence inside of you, right? And to tap into these really primordial anger juices. And
Mm,
so, that's on one hand, there's, and even the movie reminded me of these Sports Center clips of like Jacked Up. And every week they would have
mm,
like the top 5 plays, the hardest hitting plays from the week. And they were always so vicious. And I remember as a high schooler, as a college student, celebrating these plays. There were
mm.
commercials celebrating players hitting other people, Terry Tate, office linebacker, if you remember that commercial, right? These players just annihilating other players, and it was celebrated, right? So I think we need to talk about not just that there's damage, but we have literally created a culture of acceptance around the violence of this sport and of sports in general. I don't want to just single out football because I think it's true of so many other sports as well, where we celebrate violence even in sports that don't, really require it. And so, I think there's an importance to this masculinity as well, or this as masculinity as well, because what I think of here is denial, right? That, something is unhealthy about what I'm doing. So a lot of times when we have such a strong presence of something like masculinity, then we adhere to it. We stick even more to our guns around it, and that has made change historically difficult, right? With lots of different aspects of masculinity, but specifically when we talk about sports here and the NFL.
Yeah, and I mean, I really appreciate you bringing up even kind of the nuance here around like that celebration, because I was even thinking about just like growing up and watching football, and then I went on to marry somebody who played football for 10 years, then ended up doing something slightly less violent or maybe more violent of rugby. I don't know, but just really contact sports. And I would talk to Keenan a lot about that of like, what was that like to just put your body like on the line like that
Hmm.
over and over again? And kind of what it does for you psychologically as well, because you're being praised by coaches, you're being praised by people to be like, man, you're tough. Like you took that hit like a man, quote unquote, right? And so
Hmm.
that entire culture, such a young age of getting validated around that, how does that not become part of your identity? Of like, yeah, I was able to do that. And then the next hit, I'm going to make sure I do that too, or more of it. I mean, there's no way for that wiring and messaging to not be just so indicative of how you think of yourself and how you think of, yeah, just huge identity themes there.
Yeah. Let's get into what actually happens. What do we see? What were we seeing in these players? You know, kind of quote unquote out loud, like I like to think about it. What were they displaying symptom wise? What criteria are being met here for these? And let's focus on CTE in terms of, what was that long term impact that, these football players were experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're specifically talking to kind of go back to CTE, we're talking about this degenerative brain disease that disrupts the functioning and kills nerve endings. So, like other neurocognitive diseases, I mean, we look at TBI, I've mentioned, we look at Alzheimer's, we've looked at dementia, we look at even Parkinson's. There will always be this psychological component that tends to happen first. And so as we're talking about some of these young players, we're talking about symptoms appearing possibly like years or decades after a concussion, right? So it's not like this immediate thing that happens right away. The aggression, the mood swings, the cognitive issues, those are really connected to memory loss, confusion, motor problems, balance, tremors, which is like similar to Parkinson's, and all of the cognitive decline that comes with it. A lot of the work that we were doing at our postdoc fellowship was like a mental status exam to kind of see like where are you right now, right? How oriented are you? And I would venture to say if you're on the field and you're talking to NFL players, they very much know where they are and what they're doing, right? The decline didn't set in after the hit in that way. Like when we're talking about CTE, it's down the line. And so the diagnosis is really, it's only definitive after death. And I think that's the hardest part. It's a brain autopsy that has to be done. That's the only way to really get a true, accurate diagnosis. And so what's really important is if you're playing these sports at this high level, how are doctors, like how did they have their eyes on you? Because we can suspect it and we can have like a probable working diagnosis of like, hey, you're exhibiting some of these symptoms that are connected to CTE in living patients. But here are some of the changes we can make. And it always makes me think of like Muhammad Ali, where I'm like, you think it's going to be like one fight or one hit. You think it's going to be this like life-changing thing that happens, but and equally like heartbreaking and sad, but over the course of time, you may not know that that is like what you were doing down the line, like your future will hold those declines. And I think a lot of this culture of like it's one more year, I'm not ready to retire, it's just a few more hits. I don't think we're necessarily thinking about the repercussions of that, as a community, as a culture, as a country. And so that's kind of where my heart goes out to families and where I really think about like my own kiddos. And I'm like, man, Keenan has said this many times, like, I don't want our kids like playing football. And I'm like, yeah, I think when you've done it for so long yourself, there's no way for it to not impact you. Yet here we are, we're watching it. Like you said, we're like, celebrating the wins, we're grieving the losses, but it's no joke to be, in the line of fire, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a hard one to reconcile, and I think, the cumulative impact is I think what's really hard to predict, right? They have, they've improved their ability to assess concussions in real
Right.
time, right? They've changed, a lot of sports have changed rules around, taking a player off the field if there's
Yes.
even any sign of, some sort of head injury. I'm a big soccer fan, and what they have started doing is if there's even a hint of a head injury, they will stop play and have, the medics come out and just double check, or have the player, come off the field temporarily so that there's no doubt. And I've watched soccer games where, players have banged heads and then, one is stumbling around and they just continue playing, right? And so, like we said before, this happens in lots of different sports, and it's hard to figure out, where's the line between player safety and putting out a good product, right? Because these are billions of dollars on the line for these players. These players are paid tens of millions of dollars
Oh, yeah.
nowadays, right? And so, how can you tie that in with masculinity and then the power of money? And, we have a real interesting formula here for controversy around, what is the boundary here between letting these guys play and make their own choices to play dangerous sports and put themselves at risk and make good money, right? Also set their families potentially up, but also
Absolutely.
recognize that, a very tiny percent of people who play sports will make it professionally to a level where they can truly set their families up for financial success and generational wealth or whatever that looks like, right? So I think this is the controversy here too, is the power and persuasion of the sport, and how do we regulate, and then how do we continue to put checks into place that allow, the medical professionals to truly monitor symptoms, to truly monitor the impact. I think, there are players out there that have had multiple concussions, and they're all, there are players that, have to have that discussion probably internally with their families or with their coaches that, how much longer do I continue to put myself at risk? And do I say, hey, making X amount of money is worth this kind of quality of life after I'm done playing? And so, and I think that's the tough thing, right? That you mentioned here as well, is that, some of these symptoms don't show up for so long, and then all of a
Right.
sudden they come, can come quickly, and you see that cognitive decline, and you see with some of these players, real serious like bouts of anger, violence towards self or others, you know, psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, significant mood shifts, significant personality shifts. And, you have these families who, in hindsight, then can point the finger and say, hey, this happened then. But, seeing those signs and symptoms earlier where you can have intervention is really difficult right now. And so, let's get into what they're trying to do. What
Yeah.
have we noticed as both fans, and as, as professionals in this field, what have we seen in terms of changes, specific to the NFL or otherwise?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like we've all seen, I think if you're a fan of the game, you will kind of see the concussion protocols have changed. There's like now a five-step return to play process. There's no-go symptoms of like not getting back in the game. There's rule changes. I think the rule changes are more like reducing head-to-head contact and like the overhauling of the kickoff. I know there's like really specific changes there, like helmet first contact, protecting defenseless players, all the language that we've kind of seen around that. And then equipment and technology has improved with the NFL. Apparently, they have released like annual helmet safety ratings and mandated guardian caps during training camp. And then there's this whole piece that also I would imagine if you're Dr. Amalu, like the financial and research commitments that the NFL has made, I don't know. I have not studied the NFL's research, but it just includes a little bit more commitment to saying, okay, hey, we're going to be on top of understanding what's going on. There was a landmark lawsuit settlement with former players. I think they said it was like hundreds of millions of dollars pledged for independent medical research. And that's kind of where the NFL's at now to say, okay, hey, we're going to be looking into this. We're going to be researching it. I think to go back to the book, right? The NFL putting out their own research,
Mhm.
how do we feel about that? What is that going to be? Like, I think when you're trying to keep a billion-dollar industry going, these are really heroes like Dr. Amalu and his colleagues, like putting their name out there, putting this is their livelihood, who they are. They have families themselves, and trying to expose an industry like this to help save people, because it's not just NFL
Mhm.
players, like you're saying. There's a lot of people who play contact sports who don't know like the suffering that is ahead or that they've already endured. And so I think the research will be ongoing, but that's kind of just to summarize a little bit of like what the NFL has tried to do and is doing. I mean, I guess you could say like we are seeing a lot of those changes in that way.
Yeah, and I'll add on the youth front, I think there's been significant changes in terms of not allowing contact or, helmets and pads type of play for, most ages, at least until middle school or even high school, some places, and reducing the amount of, physicality to the
Mm.
sport, making it more like flag football, something of that vein. I think what sticks with me too is, we had a discussion in a sports psychology class that I took around this, and in youth and in middle school or younger athletes, these are people who have wide arrays of bodies, right? Because you have people at different stages of
Yeah,
development, adolescence, pre-adolescence. And so you might have one kid who's 6'2" and 200 pounds, and then you might have another kid who's 5'1" and 100 pounds, right? Like you're going to have
right,
this significant disparity. And these are, still developing kids who
right,
don't have full control of their body, don't know how to utilize it in healthy ways necessarily, and also don't have the neck strength of a college or NFL player. And yet, because we also live in a culture that sometimes idolizes these players and puts them up on pedestals, then you have kids trying to mimic some of the things that they might see on TV and do so in a potentially dangerous environment. And I think that's where I do like some of the changes that have been made because they had to persuade public opinion. You had this stretch where all of these players, famous players, were dying in their 50s, from suicide or from some sort
right.
of aggressive substance use or a car accident or something that was due in part to some of the symptoms that they're experiencing. And so it was really important that this get out regardless of how much money it might cost, these industries. And so I do think that is having a cascade effect. And I think there's a lot to be seen too in terms of the future of college football and NFL football that rely on youth sports for
Right.
development. I think it's to be seen how will these sports evolve after one, two, or three generations of kids who are now growing up in this time where there's so much more known about it and so many more protective measures being put into place every season.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I mean, again, I think we'll probably do another episode, like similarly, like on sports and the psychological effects, because really, as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about too was we didn't even get into all of the major psychological undertones of like the identity piece, right? So when some of that motor planning, when some of the cognitive decline is happening and you become aware of it, or the mood swings, like that's deeply depressing. I mean, you're talking about really young players, like young guys who are starting to lose parts of themselves or their identity. They're not like themselves. You hear this with TBI all the time. This isn't my brother. This isn't my sister. This isn't the person that I knew. And so that sense of loss, that grief, and we're talking about you have to stop playing. You're being forced to stop playing. Who are you if you're not playing the sport? And some of that substance use that you're talking about, or abuse, the negative coping skills that come into that, that play into that, right? Which is like the suicidality, the depression, the anxiety, the trauma, the sadness around all of it, which is like, if I'm not this, like, who am I? And so I think there will be future episodes for us to really talk about, and especially your background in sports as well, sports psychology, and just like a fan, but really trying to understand that connection. It makes me think of Ted Lasso too, of the season where they brought in a sports psychologist to really do some of that work. Where are we looking to try to implement that as mandatory, and that not doing like damage control in terms of like, hey, XYZ thing happened, let's call a therapist in. You and I talk about that as therapists all the time. Like, we want you to come in even on the good days. We want to kind of understand what happened that made this a good week. And sometimes when we're using therapy as like this crisis management, we're not getting the most out of it. And so what happens if players have access to therapists regularly as part of their protocol? So in the same way that they're coming in, they're doing blood work, they're getting checked out, they're getting physicals, they're getting imaging, they're also seeing a therapist. That is just so necessary. Just I can't stress that enough, that there is so much to process. There's shame, there's guilt, there's anxiety, there's performance anxiety. I mean, there's pressure. There's just a lot happening, and I wish we could start that very young, like within our school systems too, to say, hey, like, football teams are going to also go to the counseling center because this is a way for us to promote health, not because something's wrong, not because something's bad and like you need to go talk to someone, but this is a way for us to take care of our health.
Yeah, I love what you said there, because I think monitoring health is, kind of central to maintaining, right? And, if we don't go to the doctor for a few years, there's a likelihood that we've got some condition that could have been treated earlier.
Yeah,
And,
prevented
so
even.
yeah, and so shifting towards preventative healthcare is really, central to this. I also, what you just said also sparked something in terms of kind of how do we do indirect measures? How do we enact indirect measures that help with this? Giving kids who, there's a lot of people who come from low income backgrounds, and with the hopes that professional sports can really pull them out of poverty. And can we set athletes up, student athletes, high school and college level student athletes, can we set them up for success so that we can separate their athlete identity from their
Mm,
main identity, right? So they're not so dependent on, hey, I'm known for being the star quarterback or the linebacker or the top recruit for this program. And can I separate that and build, a holistic education for myself so that I don't have to rely on football? So if football doesn't work out for some reason, whether it's an injury, right, which happens to most players,
yeah.
line that stuck out from me to me from the movie was like, we just have to finish the game, right? Like, that's the goal, is
Mm,
you just have to survive the violence of the game. Like, that's so telling. And so, what if we also made sure that student athletes were well-rounded scholars and had options in terms of, what to do with their money, how to, rely on their other skills, so that their physicality is not the only thing that they're relying on. And so they stick to the sport for too long, right? And they're able to step away when, their body is telling them to. And so I think that's a whole maybe other question about this. I'm thinking about
yeah.
Maslow's hierarchy, but I think that's really fascinating because there's a lot of ways to attack this. And I want to just end on this question of, can football and I guess sports, by like these violent sports by extension, can they ever be truly safe? And what does that mean for letting kids play or continuing the sport in general? Any final thoughts on the kind of the future
Yeah.
of this?
Yeah. I mean, I think truthfully, I don't know how I would have answered this before having kids, but I think about it a lot as a parent. And like, I don't see football being safe. Now, is that a judgment around you play, you don't play? No, that's just me saying what I know about playing, not just at a high level, but I just mean consistently playing. Like, you don't even have to be good, man. You just get in there and you get hit. Like, over and over and
Mm.
over again. And that is really scary. So I don't know how we make this safer. I think some of the protocols that we're seeing, I think we're just like tip of the iceberg in terms of the NFL of like, okay, let's get some things in place, even if it's to save face or to kind of combat some of these lawsuits. If it's protecting the players and it's helping get more physicians' eyes on them, okay, like we're all for it, right? Like we also want some of that safety. Yes, we love and enjoy to play football, but you and I can think of multiple times I mean, think about Hamlin, like these moments where someone's hit, someone's hurt, someone's down. That's like devastating and heartbreaking, and it brings you back to this reality of like this is a game. This is a game. You know, as seriously as we take sports and like these are human beings and they have families and they're people. And I don't know that the way American football is set up to be played will ever really be safe, but my hope is that like within the youth, right? Because we're not all playing at an NFL level, that we can start to implement some of these like healthier protocols to so that kids can get these really positive pieces of being parts of sports teams and the camaraderie and the connection, the physicality. Like there's so many beautiful things that exist too. And so if we can really like marry the safetiness with it, you know, we're on to something. But it is, like you said, by nature a violent sport.
Yeah, and I love what you brought up because I think it is important to recognize that there are significant benefits to participating in, a team sport, something where you are unified towards common goals, and you have different positions and strategies, and so there's real skill sets here to be learned, but of course with as much safety as possible. Now, anytime you're taking any sort of physical risk, the risk is going to be greater than zero. But, reducing that, as much as harm reduction is a central principle to mental health care, right? And so I think that's where the focus has to continue to be. And if you can put, as many resources into the research and the creation of tools and products that can enhance safety as you do to the commercial side of the sport, then you're doing at least the player's safety some justice here. And so it is a responsibility, of these big industries to do their due diligence. And my hope is, and I think our hope is here, that they are trying to do that more than, what they claim to have done in the past. And I think the public opinion speaks loudly.
Yeah. And if we could just also protect Joe Burrow's toe, life could
Yeah.
have felt different today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing that up at the end. I will be
Yeah, I
crying
just wanted to
myself to
remind, yeah,
sleep.
just wanted to remind you in case you forgot.
Yeah. So if we had a guardian cap, and a guardian cap, if nobody knows, is this bigger padded helmet that some players have chosen to wear. You may see it on the football field this season. Yeah, maybe we need one of those for Joe Burrow's toe, knee, wrist, everything. So, all right, this is the Think Good podcast.
Yes.
We really appreciate you all joining us, and hopefully you join us soon for another exciting topic.
Yes.
See
Peace
y'all later.
out. Bye.